Identical twins raised apart in completely different families, countries, and cultures still show striking similarities in personality, interests, phobias, and even humor. Jim Springer and Jim Lewis, separated at birth and reunited at 39, had both married women named Linda, divorced them, and remarried women named Betty. They shared the same hobbies, had similar IQ scores, and both drove the same model of car. Twin studies reveal how deep the genetic contribution to behavior runs, and how difficult it is to separate from environment. Heritability is a statistical concept that captures the proportion of variability in a trait within a specific population that can be attributed to genetic differences. A heritability of 0.5 for a trait means that 50% of the variation between people in that population on that trait is accounted for by genetic differences. Heritability is often misunderstood. It does not mean that genetics determines a fixed percentage of an individual's trait value, and it is not a fixed property of the trait. Heritability estimates change with the population and environment studied. Twin studies are the cornerstone of behavioral genetics. Identical or monozygotic, twins share 100% of their DNA. Fraternal or dizygotic, twins share on average 50%, the same as ordinary siblings, but raised together. By comparing trait similarity in identical versus fraternal twin pairs, researchers can estimate the genetic contribution to a trait. If identical twins are substantially more similar than fraternal twins for a trait, that suggests genetic influence. If identical twins raised apart are nearly as similar as those raised together, it suggests that the shared environment contributes little. Adoption studies provide a complementary method for separating genetic and environmental influences. An adopted child shares genes with biological parents, but environment with adoptive parents. If the child resembles biological parents more than adoptive parents on a trait, say, IQ or personality, that suggests genetic influence. If the child resembles adoptive parents more, that suggests environmental influence. The strongest evidence for genetic influence on intelligence, for example, comes from finding that adopted children's IQs correlate more strongly with their biological parents' IQs than with their adoptive parents. One of the most important modern insights in behavioral genetics is that genes do not operate in isolation. They interact with the environment in complex ways. A gene may only increase the risk of a disorder in the presence of certain environmental triggers. The MAOA gene variant, colloquially called the warrior gene, increases risk of aggressive behavior, but only in people who experience childhood abuse, not in those with secure childhoods. Phenylketonuria, a genetic metabolic disorder, causes intellectual disability only if the child consumes phenylalanine. Remove it from the diet and normal development proceeds. Evolutionary psychology applies the logic of natural selection to behavior. Natural selection is the process by which traits that increase survival and reproductive success in a given environment become more common in a population across generations. Because behavioral tendencies are heritable, natural selection shapes not just physical traits, but psychological mechanisms. Fears, mating preferences, cooperation tendencies, and parenting behaviors can all be understood as evolved solutions to recurrent adaptive problems faced by our ancestors. Evolutionary psychology argues that many universal human psychological tendencies are adaptations, features selected because they solved specific problems in our ancestral environment. The near-universal human fear of snakes and spiders, but not cars, reflects the fact that snakes and spiders were genuine threats for millions of years, while cars have existed for barely a century. Sexual jealousy patterns, preferences for sweet and fatty foods, coalition-building tendencies, and in-group favoritism all have evolutionary explanations rooted in the adaptive challenges of ancestral social life. Epigenetics refers to changes in gene expression that do not involve alterations to the DNA sequence itself. Environmental factors, diet, stress, toxin exposure, early care, can add or remove chemical tags to DNA or associated proteins that switch genes on or off. These epigenetic changes can be long-lasting and in some cases heritable across generations. Michael Meaney's research on rat mothers showed that pups who received high levels of maternal licking and grooming developed different stress response patterns through epigenetic changes in the glucocorticoid receptor gene, a striking demonstration that parental behavior is literally written into gene expression. The nature versus nurture debate is largely resolved in modern behavioral science. The answer is always both, and the interesting question is how they interact. There are no purely genetic behaviors. Even the most heritable traits require an environment to be expressed. And there are no purely environmental behaviors. Even the most cultural practices are expressed through brains shaped by evolution. The concept of a reaction range captures this. Genes set a range of possible outcomes. An environment determines where within that range the phenotype falls. Intelligence has heritability estimates of around 50% in adults in Western samples, but this is consistently misinterpreted. 50% heritability does not mean genes account for half of a given person's intelligence. It means that in the population studied, about half the variance in intelligence scores is associated with genetic differences. The same gene can lead to very different IQ outcomes in impoverished versus enriched environments, a fact demonstrated by the Flynn effect. IQ rising by 30 points over a century purely through environmental change. A common misconception is that evolutionary fitness refers to physical fitness or strength. In evolutionary terms, fitness means reproductive success, the number of offspring who survive to reproduce. An organism can be physically weak, but reproductively prolific and have high fitness. Another misconception is that evolution produces organisms optimized for current environments. In fact, evolution produces organisms adapted to ancestral environments that may or may not match current conditions. Our evolved preference for high-calorie foods made sense in environments of scarcity, but contributes to obesity in environments of abundance. The fundamental lesson of behavioral genetics and evolutionary psychology is that human nature is neither blank slate nor genetic destiny. We are evolved creatures whose behavioral tendencies were shaped by ancestral environments, expressed through a complex genome, and modulated by every experience we have had. The most honest answer to what makes us who we are is everything, all at once, interacting.